if you were sick, you wouldn't go on Google to try to figure out why you were sick.
Well,
Well,
you're
we're
not
not.
supposed to.
We all do that sometimes, and then we go to it. So that's a good example. We do that sometimes. We look it up on some website, and all of a sudden, my shoulder ache means I have cancer.
It starts out with, yeah, I've got a cough, and I go on WebMD, and then it ends, and I'm like looking for coffins on Amazon and seeing what can be Prime delivered.
Hey everyone, I'm Meredith Shirey. I'm a licensed psychotherapist specializing in relationship issues.
And I'm Isaiah Vallejo-Justy, a divorce attorney.
This is a podcast about filling in the gaps of our relationships, the deeply personal choices we make for our families and ourselves,
and the impact our actions have on the rest of our lives. This is Love Me or Leave Me.
On our last episode, we talked quite a bit about what 2020 was like and how we should try to restructure things coming out of it. And as we're going into the second wave of the pandemic, and we mentioned throughout that episode several times communication and needing to communicate. So we thought it'd be really, really helpful to have a few episodes on communication. Now, Isaiah and I have very interesting careers where there's a lot of overlap. And this is one where our strategies are going to deviate a bit and take a bit of a diverging path. And so we're going to have one episode that's going to be dedicated to Isaiah talking about how to make divorce a less painful process, or try to, something that can hopefully leave you and whoever else is involved as unscathed as possible and with the best outcome. And so some strategies for how to hopefully make that a little more harmonious. And then the second episode is going to be focused more on maybe if you're not in a place where you're leaving a relationship, but you really need to find some new ways to connect with your partner and to improve your communication, manage conflict. That's what the second episode is going to focus on. And so if you're not finding what you need in episode one, make sure you stay tuned for both parts.
Let's rock and roll.
Let's do it. Yeah. So, Isaiah, one of the things I have loved about working with you over the years is how effective you are in helping people to get through what is obviously a very, very painful process of getting a divorce. And you have this way of connecting with people and helping them and coaching them through it to make it as pain-free as possible, which I think is incredible and has been why you're my number one source for referring clients to you. And also too, why the line I always use with clients when I'm giving the referral is to say, if I were going through a divorce, Isaiah is who I would want to go to. And in fact, when I went through a divorce like 8 years ago, I wish you had been my attorney because it might have gone a little better.
Oh, well, thank you. Divorce is a very painful time in somebody's life. And it doesn't matter if you have kids, if you don't have kids, if you're married for 20 years, 5 years, 3 months, regardless, you met a person, you fell in love with a person, you picked the perfect tuxedo, the perfect white dress, and this marks an end to that. And so a lot of people, when they're going through the process, they're not just mourning, the fact that they're losing a spouse, but they're also mourning their ideas about marriage and about that real kind of cultural construct we build around it.
So it really becomes an existential loss, not just the loss of the relationship.
I think you'd be able to speak more of that than me, but I think that's about right.
You're not just mourning the loss of the relationship when you're mourning a divorce, and it's different even than mourning a death, because when someone dies, that's the end. There is no more. But when you have a relationship that ends and a marriage that ends that you thought was going to be till death do us part, it's like you're mourning what would have been, like the potential for the relationship, and you're mourning the future that you thought you would have had with this person.
Can be worse than that, because what happens is both parties, they move on with their life. But if there's still like a remnant of a connection, for example, with their children, you're going to see how that person's doing 5 years from now. And if that person is doing much better than they were, because people tend to grow over time when they were married to you, that I imagine could be very painful.
That is actually something that I know you and I have talked about because we're both children of divorce. When you have children with somebody, when you get a divorce, don't for a second think you're ending the relationship. You're shifting the boundaries. But if you have children, you're going to be in each other's lives forever. And so you have to find a way to have some kind of harmony.
Yes, I mean, if you have children, you're going to be working with each other for many years, depending upon how old the children are. The younger they are, the longer you're going to have a very structured relationship as far as access sharing and decision making. So you really should take that into account. But even when the kids are ultimately emancipated, become adults, even then you're going to have a relationship with the other person because there's graduations and weddings and grandchildren.
When you're dealing with divorce cases, or when you think about the people you've seen in your office going through this, why do you think it becomes contentious? Or where do you think are there areas where communication breaks down a bit?
If people are getting divorced, communication has broken down in probably a number of areas. And divorce is already a contentious topic. You're ending a relationship. In New York, at least, and probably other states as well, the courts view a marriage as an economic partnership. So, what you're trying to dissolve is this partnership and all of its ties so that both parties can go on with their lives. But if you're going through a divorce, you probably are not going to agree upon what ending those ties and separating looks like. And that's where a lot of the contention comes in.
I know when I went through a divorce, I was lucky enough that we didn't have kids and shared assets because we were both very young. And so it was quick and easy and over with very quickly because there was nothing really to fight over. But I would imagine that if you've had lives that have been intertwined for years and years, that becomes exponentially more difficult. So there's that old adage, pick your battles. When it comes to divorce, and what you were talking about in terms of fighting for your clients and representing them and trying to get them the most in terms of what makes sense for them, right? Um, how should people decide what's worth fighting for? So the things that you were saying take sometimes can take years in court to fight out. What is actually worth going down that road versus what are maybe some areas where people need to try to just be a little more conciliatory?
Well, I mean, you don't want to be in court fighting over who gets what couch and who gets what.
What was that old country song, Who Gets a Family Bible? You remember that?
No, I don't. But
Oh,
that's a
never
good
mind.
example. Yeah, that's a good example, right? You don't want to end up fighting over those things, which have no real monetary value, and then end up paying more legal fees for the thing you're fighting over than it would cost to get a new one.
Don't say that to people in the South. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm actually not kidding. But anyway, moving on.
So yeah, so you don't want to do that, right? When it comes to picking your battles, then there's other things, right? That are completely worth it. Like if there's some type of separate property claim, so like real money or something like that, there may be worth it to have a more contentious battle over that. Or if there are children involved, then there's a dispute over children or possible concerns of abuse, things of that nature. Then absolutely, like there's no price you can put on children. Then all your rights to children. So that would be an area where you absolutely want to make sure that you protect your rights fully.
Would you maybe say then that children and conversation around those, is that an area where you find that people trip up quite a bit?
Yes and no. Usually in a divorce, people can come to loose terms among themselves about the children. Usually people who are getting divorced aren't pointing at each other and calling each other bad parents. Usually. It does happen, right? And it does happen often, but it's not the rule. So in those cases where, if you could look at your wife or your husband or your spouse and look at that person and say, he or she is a reasonably good parent, then that's the type of matter where y'all can probably have some discussions about custody loosely and then go to your attorneys and say, look, this is kind of what we've loosely discussed. What do you think? As an attorney, we're always going to have flavor to add. We're always going to have ways to protect you more. That's our job. But you have a baseline understanding as to what it takes to be a parent, what it takes to take care of your kids. So you absolutely can have those types of discussions with your spouse. I would, always encourage people to speak with their attorneys and find out what their legal rights are.
When it comes to situations maybe where people either don't see eye to eye on their expectations for having access to the kids, or if something breaks down as they begin the divorce process and maybe one person has unreasonable expectations, is that something where they then need to go and have the attorneys iron that out? Does the law have any mandates around who gets how much time?
No, the law's mandate is what happens is whatever is in the best interest of the children.
But that's pretty subjective, isn't it?
Yeah, so is custody, right? So is divorce. Each marriage is different. Every marriage is different. I used to always say, if anybody ever looks at an individual marriage, they would think that the two people in the marriage are crazy because and it can be a very successful marriage because that's the way it is. So every marriage, every divorce is highly individualized and it makes the law, somewhat flexible. So while there is law surrounding all these things, especially when it comes to custody, a lot of it is subjective. A lot of it's going to depend upon the individual circumstances of the parents. So for example, if you have two people getting divorced and they have a couple kids, but the wife has to work every day to 10 p.m. at night and the husband is, let's say, a school teacher and is home every day at 3 p.m., there's no hard and fast rule that's going to say, well, obviously there should be 50-50 access there, or the mom should have primary residential custody, should reside primarily with her because she's not there. On the flip side, if there's some type of abuse going on, then obviously that the parent that's the abuser is not going to end up with real access to the children. So it's really, really highly dependent upon, what's going on in that individual circumstance. And I think that's kind of the way it should be, right? As human beings, we're all different. Our marriages are all different. Our kids are all different. So you can't have a hard and fast rule for everybody.
And that makes sense then because you're saying couples should try to work that out and come up with some kind of preliminary agreement before you go to the attorney. Let's say that I'm coming to you and I'm saying, "Hey, I'm going to be getting a divorce and I'm going to talk to my partner about this. What should I make sure to mention or to not mention? What would be helpful going into that conversation to make it a peaceful conversation?"
Basically, you don't want to get too specific. You want to just talk in very broad terms about what people's expectations are, right? You don't want to really come to any type of agreement or come to any type of like, this is our super definite access schedule. If you can do that, then fine. But I mean, there's a lot to consider in those things. So basically, you just want to come up with like a broad framework of like an understanding as to what people's expectations are. Because usually both parties, especially in this day and age, would have gone on Google and Googled custody and what to expect and or maybe read a book or two about this. People tend to be somewhat informed consumers when it comes to this stuff. So you can try to take advantage of that and try to figure out where people are. And if that place where your spouse is diametrically opposed to where you are, then you want to say, okay, well, thanks for telling me that. I'm really going to think about it. I appreciate your point of view. And then you're going to go talk to an attorney and figure out what's actually possible, as opposed to like, just saying, okay, well, let's try to ferret it out ourselves. And then like having a huge blow up about the issue unnecessarily, maybe, or maybe necessarily, but you're not really fully informed of your legal rights. On the other hand, if your spouse comes to you and says, look, this is what I was really thinking of with respect to access and those things with respect to the children and how we're going to see them, how we're going to make decisions. And that sounded okay to you. It's okay to say, well, that sounds pretty okay to me. Let me think about it some more, and then you go to an attorney and you discuss it. Either way, you want to go to an attorney and discuss your rights, but there's nothing wrong with having the discussion.
I know like a lot of times when I've had clients who've talked about going through a divorce, people want the option of mediation because in their minds at least it will be less contentious and lead to something slightly more amicable. But if you have children, is that necessarily in your best interest or in the best interest of the parents to go the strict mediation route?
Well, that's a good question. Mediation is an option for any case, and it's something that I help clients do all the time. Whether or not it's something that's advantageous for clients is going to depend upon their abilities to communicate with each other and to speak with each other and to figure out things, kind of on their own through the usage of a mediator. If it's going to be a process where, that's going to be more contentious or where somebody is disrespectful of the other person when it comes to their methods of communication or ignores the person or doesn't respect the person's ability to think or to come to logical conclusions, then that's not going to be a case where I would necessarily recommend mediation. But if the two people can communicate with each other, then you can. Whether you mediate or not, you still should have an attorney to advise you on these things, right? Because what happens in mediation, at least in New York, is that you meet with that mediator, assuming you have a good one, then you come to terms and agreement, and then you go see an attorney. But then the attorney is going to inform you of what your legal rights are. And then once you hear what your legal rights are, you may not like what you agreed to. So then that tends to sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes blow up a deal. So that's why if you're informed all along, you know what you're agreeing to and you know the consequences of that.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think while we're on the subject of children in custody, because again, I would imagine that this is probably one of the main points in a divorce that becomes tricky to navigate. One of the things that I get asked all the time by clients is, how do I tell my children about the divorce? And especially when you were talking about when you've got instances where maybe there's a power imbalance between these partners, if you've got two spouses who don't see eye to eye, right? But we have these children that we're both still going to parent. How do we go about communicating with them about what's going on with the divorce, and how do we communicate with each other?
That's a great question. The truth is that, like, while there may be power imbalances and all these things, when it comes to the children, you need to be on equal footing, right? And usually, a lot of times, the power imbalance when it comes to, let's say, finances or when it comes to working, that power balance is reversed when it comes to the children. If there's two spouses and one works more than the other, then the other one is usually taking care of the children more than the one who's working more. And that happens a lot. And where that happens, the children are going to naturally lean on the person that's there for them more. Sometimes, right? Not all the time, but sometimes. So sometimes those power balances will shift. But the truth of it is that you both have equal rights to your children, right? This is the person who you've decided to get married and to have these children with. We didn't create the situation. You kind of created the situation. So now that you're in this situation, when it comes to, you chose that you wanted to have children with. That's what I mean by create the situation. Now that this has been done, now you guys should sit down together if you're going to speak with your children and tell them, what's going on. But you do that as equals and as a united front without any imbalances, because what you don't want to do is drag your children into a messy divorce, because that can hurt them. Usually, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Meredith, because I think you may have been the one to actually tell me this, but the studies will show that a divorce doesn't necessarily affect children negatively. Two things do, right? Either a marriage that's abusive and it's just gone on for too long, or a divorce that's very messy and the children are very much involved.
That's exactly right. So there's this big misnomer and misconception that divorce is just across the board categorically bad for children, leads to maladjustment, all these other things. And that's simply not true. What leads to better adjustment outcomes for children is parents who are connected or can communicate with one another, and there's a trusting, safe relationship there where the children find their parents to be emotionally safe with the children and with one another. The other big predictor for poor childhood outcomes is actually maternal depression, which is also a big part of, again, relationship adjustment. So one of the things we said last time was that the couple is so important, and that's why it's so important to take care of your relationship, because without that, there is no family. And so one of the best things you can do for your children is to have a healthy relationship with the other parent.
Right. And actually, believe it or not, because of those studies, right, New York in particular has said that the parent who gets custody of the children is the parent who's going to engender a better relationship between the child and the non-custodial parent. So you want to make sure that you're fully supportive of your children seeing the non-custodial parent, of your children spending time with each other, splitting time. It's funny. We've come so far along in technology. We've come so far along in everything. And when it comes to custody, this is still the court of Solomon, right? Where Solomon said, cut the baby in half. And the real mother said, no, please don't do that. That is the person who gets custody, right?
Oh,
so if I had one piece of it,
hopefully New York has not taken a baby to court and being like, all right, are we
Well,
doing this? I mean, we're getting to some biblical
that's
stuff
right.
here.
Well, if I have one piece of advice, I have one real piece of advice for parents out there. Don't cut your baby in half.
Oh my God, we just went to a weird dead baby joke segment. Wow, this took a turn, guys.
In all seriousness, what does that mean, right? That's metaphorical. Really.
Oh, you meant emotionally
Right.
cut. I was literally thinking you're like, Texas Chainsaw Massacring your
Well,
kids. Like I went so literal
that's
with
not a
that.
divorce case. That's a criminal case, and somebody's going to go to jail for a
All right.
long time.
Yeah, that's not family court anymore. Okay, different section. All right,
Right,
moving
right.
on.
But
Sorry about that.
metaphorically speaking, what that means is you put your children's needs above your own, right? And the parent that's kind of willing to do that, that's the parent who's going to get custody if there's a contested custody battle. And if both parents are willing to do that, then it's really a joint custody situation. In most cases, are a joint custody situation. Finances are the other big area of a divorce, and what my recommendation for people is always the same. Before you have those types of discussions, you should really find out what your rights are in the financial realm of things, and that doesn't only deal with child support. It also deals with maintenance. New York calls it maintenance. The rest of the country calls it alimony or palimony. New York likes to be special. We're special here in New York. Yeah, so there's that. There's equitable distribution. If you guys own a home together, or if their bank accounts, or various other assets, business interests, things like that. You need to find out what it is that you're possibly entitled to, or what your possible exposure is, before you go and have financial conversations with your spouse. There are attorneys who will charge you consultation fees for that, and there's attorneys that won't. Consultation fees technically are usually not tremendously expensive, even if you have to pay them. It's definitely worth the money to do that prior to having those discussions, especially if you don't know what your rights are generally, or you are in the dark with respect to what your finances are.
I can't tell you how many people I've had in my office who really have no idea what their spouse's financial situation looks like, especially, and not to be too stereotyping here, um, or gender normative, but when their spouse is a male who works, especially in the finance industry, there seems to be a lot of secrecy where the partner who's maybe making quite a bit more money doesn't actually want the other partner to know. And so one thing that's come up when I'm talking to clients who are going through divorce, and they'll say, they're like, I don't know how much he or she makes. So is that something that you're obviously saying go to an attorney, but is that something that I guess you would find out through your an attorney? Is that something that the other spouse could hide or continue to hide?
You definitely find it out, right? There's various ways that we have to do that, various forms that need to be filled out, various discovery that financial disclosure has to be done. It's very difficult to hide money in a divorce,
Mm.
because money is no longer cash in a wall. Most of it is electronic. It's all on paper, somewhat. It's not an easy thing to do to hide money in divorce, and there needs to be full disclosure as to assets in a divorce.
Let's say you both came into the marriage without much. Maybe you were both just starting out, or you got married young, and then one or both of you became very successful after you got married. Does that change how assets are freed up, and also how long you're married? And then the opposite. So let's say that you both had a long life and long careers before you got married, and then you continue to have financial success after you got married, and you had a shorter marriage. Does any of that matter when it comes to dividing assets and who gets what?
Yes, it matters. Generally speaking, anything that you earn during the marriage is marital property, to the extent that you still have it, right? So if you spend your income, it's whatever you spend your income on. If there are assets that you spend your income on, like you bought a house, or you have savings accounts, or you bought a car, or whatever you did, those are marital assets that are subject to equitable distribution. Everybody says, well, it's 50-50. A lot of things are 50-50, but it is equitable distribution and not equal distribution in New York.
So what's the difference there? Can I ask you to just say a little bit more? Because I'm actually glad you said equitable does not mean equal. So what's the difference?
It's hard to speak to, because I don't want people on the podcast thinking I'm automatically entitled to 50%, or I'm not entitled to 50%, because I don't think that's fair, right?
Right.
It's dependent upon what you're speaking about. Very, very generally speaking, business assets are often not divided on 50-50 basis unless there's been physical contributions from the non-titled spouse, meaning that the non-titled spouse has kicked in money or worked in the business itself, right? Other than those two things, it's usually not a 50-50 thing, and it's going to depend upon how long the marriage was, whether the business was created during the marriage. It gets very complex, right? But what people should take away
Mm.
from this, okay, is that both parties' contributions to the marriage are respected and valued. So if you have one party who made all the money or who made most of the money, opened the business or worked on Wall Street, whatever, that person's contributions to the marriage are respected in raising the kids and getting access to the kids in maybe having a disproportionate share of the business distributed to her or him. On the flip side of that coin, the other spouse's contribution to marriage are also respected. So if that person, whether it be him or her, stayed home with the kids and raised them and maybe forewent their own careers to do so, well, you're not going to be able to leave that person broken in the street now. That doesn't work like that. So the way that person's contributions are valued is that whatever you've kind of garnered during the marriage is usually broken apart more or less on a 50-50 basis, depending upon whether you had it before the marriage or after the marriage, or if it's an active asset or a passive asset. It gets very complex. But the one thing that people should take away from this really is that just because you may have been the person who didn't work, or maybe you were the person who did work, your contributions to the marriage are respected in the law. New York is not a titled state. So whoever has title, it doesn't really matter. What matters is when the asset was obtained. And if it was obtained in a marriage, then it's marital property.
So that is, I think, a really, really good point to drive home, because I've had a lot of female clients who did not get a divorce or were very, very reluctant to for that reason, because they were worried, thinking, well, he makes all the money. I haven't had a career in 15 years because I've been raising the children. And I'm worried that he is vindictive enough that he would want to just leave us on the street. But I think that what you're saying is really helpful to hopefully empower people who are worried about that situation. Or maybe you're staying in a bad marriage because they're worried that that could happen, that their contribution wouldn't be taken into account.
And I've seen that situation several times. And look, at the end of the day, you're entitled to what you're entitled to. If they're children, you're entitled to child support. If you haven't worked in a while, you could be entitled to maintenance or alimony, right? You're entitled to child support so long as you're a primary residential custodian in New York. There's equitable distribution. You bought a house during the marriage and the house gets sold, you're entitled to half of it, depending upon whether or not they were separate property contributions. Meaning if one party had $500,000 before the marriage and then took that $500,000 and bought a house, then that party is going to be entitled to a credit for what that party contributed. But outside of those kind of scenarios, there are ways that you are protected, right? And really what those types of people should do when they have those questions is they should just go speak with an attorney. Really. I mean, that's my number one piece of advice. You know, people sometimes can be intimidated to speak with an attorney, or they can be hesitant to speak with an attorney because they think that this means that they're definitely going forward with a divorce. And that's not true. What you're trying to do is educate yourself on what your rights are. If you were sick, you wouldn't go on Google to try to figure out why you were sick.
Well, you're
we're
not
not
supposed to.
We all do that sometimes. And then we go to it. So that's a good example. We do that sometimes. We look it up on some website and all of a sudden my shoulder ache means I have cancer. Right?
Right. Or like, have you seen the ones where there's like some YouTube video or something where it starts out with, yeah, I've got a cough and I go on WebMD, and then it ends and I'm like looking for coffins on Amazon and seeing what can be prime
Exactly.
delivered.
And then you go see your doctor and your doctor's like, you have nothing, take some aspirin and you're fine, right? So it's
Right. Stop consulting Dr.
exactly.
Google.
So don't consult lawyer Google either. It's not a good idea. You go to a lawyer, you find out some information, and then you can figure it out from there what it is that you want to do. And then I think what you'll find out is that things aren't necessarily what you thought they would be.
I think that that's very, very important, and making sure, again, like everyone's situation is different. Everything needs to be taken into account. Your situation is unique. And so you need a trained professional to walk you through your specific relationship and situation. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that that's, again, why I've always loved working with you over the years, is because I know that you take the time to build that rapport with people. And given what I do, it's so important, because people, if they're asking me for that referral, one, it's one of the most vulnerable times in your life, right? Your marriage is ending. And then two, it's such a personal relationship with me that if I'm referring somebody, I need them to be able to trust who they're going to, and And that's why I think it's so wonderful when people work with you, because you take so much time to understand the situation, to develop rapport, and to really build that trust so that you can get through this in a less painful way, because they can rely on your guidance.
But I also believe in something called like almost a holistic divorce, right? Where
Mm.
you come in and this is ending, but we're gonna figure out a plan for kind of like everything. You're gonna have your financial plan, you're gonna have your plan with your children, but let's not forget about you, right? And you personally, how do you get a new job? Maybe you have some emotional issues going on that you want to work through. Well, then I have people within my network that I'm like, all right, well, you should go talk to Meredith for the therapy. You should go talk to this person to help you out with finances. I think some of these people are actually going to be coming on the show, so you'll hear from them. But that's the point, is to make the entire person better at the end of the process. Or maybe not better, maybe that person is still hurting over what's going on, but give them the tools with which they can rebuild their lives. So it's not just a matter of, okay, you're divorced and now this is the end of the relationship. But okay, you're divorced, but now you have the tools with which you're going to go forward and live this next part of your life.
I think that is such an incredible place to maybe wrap this episode up, is the hope, right? And you reminding people that life doesn't end when you sign these papers. In fact, the next chapter can begin, and you're giving people hope and excitement and motivation to do that.
Yeah, I would say that every end is a new beginning.
Love Me or Leave Me is a podcast production of the Board brand. This podcast is for informational purposes only. It does not constitute medical or legal advice and is not a substitute for professional consultation, diagnoses, or treatment. Always follow up with a licensed attorney or healthcare professional who can address your specific needs. Thanks for listening.